toolkits and solutions were developed to tackle specific challenges. Some areas of the park bridge and span the river with overlooks and recreational facilities that allow people to interact with the river in new ways. The ports and barges, which are a part of the industrial heritage, add a cultural element and provide a window to the past. And the marsh creates habitat and absorbs stormwater, while more traditional park spaces include activities like nature play. Finally, the embankments, which are a necessary aspect to protect the city from floods, are reimagined as multifunctional infrastructure with seating, overlooks, public art, and in some areas are redesigned to allow people to penetrate them for even better access into the park.
Just to remind everyone of the scale that we're working with, the park stretches over 16 linear kilometers along the Yangtze on both sides, and its width ranges from about 100 meters to over 400 meters seasonally. There's enough space to encounter a variety of experiences throughout the park, but the existing condition of the majority of these spaces are underutilized mudflats. While they don't currently offer many recreational activities, these mudflats provide really critical ecosystem services and value to the city in more unseen ways. The mudflats are an excellent opportunity for public education and to create a meaningful and authentic outdoor space that celebrates natural processes.
Mudflats tend to have a negative connotation because they're not traditionally usable, highly manicured landscapes. But in addition to their ecological services, we've incorporated recreational opportunities that allow people to engage with these vital landscapes. With some ecologically focused interventions, these once underutilized spaces are transformed into recreational, educational, and visually appealing seasonal landscapes that add to the real estate value adjacent to them.
From an economic perspective, this intervention also adds incredible value to the waterfront. Before, this 400-meter width was considered by many as a visual barrier to the water because of its unseen or misunderstood ecological value. By curating a narrative about the value of the riverfront ecology, we created a foreground that is enjoyable and educational. A diverse planting strategy adds richness by rethinking what was mostly a homogeneous landscape. And we look at the subtle topography of the mudflats and created a series of secondary channels and undulating subtle terrain that would allow for a mosaic of microclimates that will naturally evolve into diverse ecosystems that change over the seasons, as well as when the river rises and falls. So the entire landscape will become alive and evolve into different colors and compositions throughout the year.
Another traditionally overlooked element of the riverfront were the various industrial artifacts that can be found all along the Yangtze. In Wuhan, railway lines terminated at the river, and freight ferry terminals loaded the rail cars onto barges. Over decades, they've been forgotten and embedded in the weeds, just awaiting rediscovery.
Along the waterfront, we have retrofitted and reused many of these industrial elements throughout the park. That creates a completely different experience along the river.
On our first site visit to Wuhan, we were so in awe of the beauty of these industrial artifacts. Because the scale of the riverfront is so vast, when you're walking along its edge, you have a sense of immeasurable scale where everything is far away. But these huge pieces of infrastructure, whether it's a bridge spanning the river or caissons from the former freight terminals, despite their massive size, they provide you with a sense of intimacy because they're the only spaces on the river where there's a sense of containment and confinement.
When these areas are flooded, you may hardly see any of these remnants as they are lost again to the river. But with artistic lighting installations, these heavy pieces of former infrastructure are reinterpreted as something delicate and fun. This combination of the old and the new allows people to reinterpret and experience the history of the river and the city itself in a very different way.
This approach also illustrates that flooding is intentional and a normal dynamic of the river. These elements don't simply disappear during seasonal floods, but are celebrated with lighting in a way that indicates they're still beautiful and important even when they're inaccessible.
Today, there are over 70 decommissioned industrial barges remaining along the river. It's interesting to observe how people have adapted some of this infrastructure in really creative ways, like a floating community garden with vegetables, with flowers. So instead of dismantling all of these industrial infrastructure as suggested by some local government agencies, we repurposed them as floating promenades that rise and fall with the river. By being out on water, people gain a new perspective, looking back at the skyline of the city and experiencing the river in a more tactile way.
When we realized that the barges were being used for these grassroots activities, it confirmed to us that people were really craving the ability to experience the river in different ways, but also that the master plan shouldn't be so prescriptive in determining how each barge might be used. Instead, they're designed as a kit of parts which can evolve over time. Allowing 70 barges to have 70 different uses is another way to celebrate the diversity of the waterfront.
Many of these barges coexist where the riverfront is narrow and the most compressed. Rather than struggling with the limited space when trying to create a public realm along the river, why not using these durable industrial infrastructure and transform them? This image shows an area between one of the barges, which is transformed